Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in tonight. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan and all of us at Books and Books, I welcome you to a virtual evening with Roy Richard Grinker to discuss Nobody's Normal, How Culture Created the Stigma of Mental Illness, published by our friends at Norton. In Nobody's Normal, Richard Grinker chronicles the progress and setbacks in the struggle against mental illness stigma from the 18th century through America's major wars and into today's high-tech economy. Roy Richard Grinker is professor of anthropology and international affairs at George Washington University. He's the author of several books, including Unstrange Minds, Remapping the World of Autism. He lives in Washington, D.C. To moderate this evening's conversation, we're joined by Ron Suskind, a Pulitzer-winning journalist, best-selling author, and the founder of Sidekicks, the company he created to support people with autism and others who are differently abled due to distinctive neurology or social cultural backgrounds. We're fortunate to have them both with us tonight. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by clicking the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of the book from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the stage. Hello.
Hi there.
Hi there. Can everyone hear us? I'm getting notes. Someone said I can't hear anything. I just want to make sure everyone can hear me and Richard clearly. My audio is fine. Thank you, Joyce. Hi there, everyone. I'm Ron Suskind. I am the author of many books, including one book called Life Animated about my son and our many-year struggle with autism. And I am delighted to be here with Richard Grinker. Richard and I have known each other for many years. We both have a child on the spectrum, and Richard has written many spectacular books. Unstrange Minds is one that many, many people have read. And of course, his latest book, Nobody's Normal, How Culture Created the Stigma of Mental Illness. And so Richard and I are going to chat tonight about all sorts of things. And then we're going to take questions in this very, very nice text link along the side of the screen. I think we'll talk for about 40 minutes, half an hour, give or take. And then we'll open it up and chat and bring it around in 1 hour, give or take. So, Richard, hi, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing pretty well. The book came out yesterday, so I've been pretty active talking to people about it, trying to get it recognized. I'm so glad that you were able to join me here. It's always wonderful to be with somebody in an event that you feel comfortable with. And, you know, you're so familiar to me, so it's a pleasure.
Richard and I have a pre-existing condition. We've known each other for many, many years. We've shared babysitters for our children. We both have Isabel, his daughter, is 29, as is my son, Owen, who is 29. And we spent years side by side in Washington, Richard doing many, many things as an anthropologist, as a big thinker. He's at George Washington University, a professor. And I was at the Wall Street Journal for many years and writing books in Washington, much of them in America's about America's power. So, Richard, let's talk about Nobody's Normal. This is an extraordinary piece of work. You know, you have developed an expertise that is very, very broad, and your engagement is really enormously diverse. I would like to throw something out just to start. Tell everybody the signature work briefly that you did in 2000 and what, South Korea. I mean, that really, that was really a signature work that has echoed across, all of the body of research on autism. Just tell them briefly what you found, what you discovered, and how it changed things.
Well, there are a number of things that I did in Korea, but I think one of the most notable that I'd like to mention is an epidemiologic study of approximately 50,000 children in a city adjacent to Seoul, in a way that Bethesda, Maryland, or Arlington, Virginia, is adjacent to Washington, D.C. And what we wanted to do was to find out what the prevalence rate of autism was there. And the question was, why would we want to know that? Well, one reason we want to know it is because the experts that I talked to in the early 2000s said, we don't have autism here. Well, I wanted to know if that was in fact the case. But there was another reason, and that was that the Centers for Disease Control was publishing almost every year new statistics on the prevalence of autism, and they were going up and up and up, and people were worried that there was an epidemic of autism in the United States. And I had this idea, maybe the rate isn't going up. Maybe we're getting a better ascertainment of it. And in fact, if we were to get a really good assessment, it would be up to 2%. Why would I think that? Because all of the methods that the Centers for Disease Control used were records-based. They were not looking at actual human beings, just at records. So when we went to South Korea, we said, well, we're not going to pay attention to records anyway because there's so few. Let's look at every child. And after 6 years, we came up with a prevalence rate of over 2.5%. That had a couple of pretty dramatic effects. First of all, people said we were nuts, couldn't be that high. And at the time, the rate in the US was still down closer to 1.2, 1.3%. And so this seemed bizarre. But of course, today, we have states like New Jersey that have prevalence rates up higher than 2.5. The second thing that happened was that it transformed the way in which people in South Korea thought about autism, from something that didn't exist to something which was common, or at least much, much more common than it was. School systems started to donate, give large amounts of money to doing screenings and to producing more expertise in autism. And what had been a shameful condition, what had been highly secretive, changed overnight, very, very quickly. And many of you know the television show The Good Doctor, right? About an autistic young physician. That was a Korean show. It started in Korea, and then it was purchased by Hollywood to be produced in the United States. It was a dramatic event when that series was developed in Korea, because it meant for the first time people were acknowledging that there were a group of young people who were not getting identified, who were not getting care. And in our sample, 2/3 of the children who qualified for a diagnosis of autism had never had any special education, no accommodation, and there was no record of any kind of psychological disturbance. These kids are now starting to get care.
Yeah. I mean, just that is such a dramatic change. You know, the fact is, it makes my heart swell to think of a time, this is almost 20 years ago, when people responded so powerfully to data, didn't question the expert, didn't question the data. Back then, I suppose some of those trends were already underway, but this data really changed the society. And I remember being in the United States, in which there was a great deal of talk about this rising epidemic of autism. Our children at that point were about 11, 12 years old.
They were born just as the rates were going up.
Right. And we were like, my God, are we at the center of some sort of epidemic, causation of which is unknown? And when we saw the numbers from South Korea, we're like, wait a minute, that's a whole nother world, another culture. Those numbers, they're like our numbers. And I'm sure these are numbers that are elsewhere, certainly in developed countries around the world. And all of a sudden, you could feel the landscape shift. Well, this is not an oddity, a rarity, some sort of outcome of a particular environmental trigger or some sort of epidemiological disease of sorts. This is about the way the world has changed and how we know what we're looking at and are ardent about seeing it for what it is. And That was an enormous change that has created a better life for children, I would dare say, born immediately after our kids, Richard.
Yeah.
I
And
mean,
Ron, I think there's there's a bigger lesson here too, which is beyond autism, which is that when we have a diagnosis, then you can drive a treatment.
Yeah.
No diagnosis is worth anything if it doesn't drive some kind of intervention or care or support or treatment. And that was the problem with these kids in South Korea. They didn't have any diagnosis at all. Now, I'm not going to say that I think it's wonderful to go labeling everybody in the world as having a mental illness or a developmental disability. But if somebody needs help, if you've crossed over from just having difficulty in the classroom to having really serious impairments, if you've crossed over from being sad to depressed, from being shy to being so introverted that you can't have social communication, well, then you should get care. But you can't get care unless there's some sort of framework or classification that we can use to guide that care.
Yep. So now that is a change that presages, predates, and drives a change in society. Now, Richard, let's get right to Nobody's Normal. What you write about is the long arc, really, of mental illness, of stigma, of how we, in a sense, define all of those terms, how we came to define them, and how I think we are beginning to feel the yield of a redefinition, which I think you almost write the arc of it here in the book. Give folks a sense of what this title, Nobody's Normal, is about. Now, as you know from book titles, you don't want to give away too much. Sort of give them the thesis that explains rather quickly in the book what that title means.
Well, Nobody's Normal is essentially a challenge to the concept of normality, which has been used and employed along with its opposite, abnormality, to enforce conformity, to demean people who were suffering from emotional distress, and even to isolate people and confine them. It wasn't so long ago that normal just meant average, and for some people, even mediocre. It was a statistical and mathematical term. And it's only mid-20th century that the word normal starts to mean something other than a statistical average. It starts to mean something that we all want to aspire to. This imagined thing, this imagined perfection of health. But everybody gets sick. Everybody changes throughout their life. To be human is to suffer. But we don't like to admit that. But that is part of it, what it is to be human. What it is to be human also means to be dependent on others. Yet we have long demeaned and shamed people who depended on others, and long demeaned and shamed people who were emotionally distressed, as if it were somehow their fault, as if there was something that they did wrong. And one of the things that my grandfather did, who's very much a part of this book, so I weave the generations of my family into it, he ran psychiatric operations in North Africa during the Tunisian campaign, treating hundreds, if not thousands, of people with psychiatric casualties. And he said, you know what? These are not abnormal people. These are normal men in abnormal circumstances. And if that's the case, if you develop a mental illness because you're existing in a horrible set of stressors, well, then it's not your fault. It's not a sign of weakness, and it's not a sign of shame. And he was so optimistic that in 1946, he prematurely announced on NBC radio that we had eradicated the stigma of mental illnesses forever. We know that that stigma is still with us. But we now find ourselves in a situation, a COVID pandemic, in which we have another universal stressor. And so we should expect that people experience significant emotional distress. If you don't, something's wrong with you. If you are not anxious about COVID, you'll probably get COVID.
Yeah.
If you're not anxious, you'll probably not even look both ways before crossing the street and get hit.
Yeah.
This is a expected and human reaction to very powerful stressors. Now, I don't want to go on too long, but I have to say that the stigma of mental illnesses has always been marked by an intersectionality as well, in which people who were already discriminated against for other reasons, like sex, race, and class, had this cascading stigma when they had mental illnesses, double, triple, quadruple illnesses that really produced undue, unneeded suffering.
You know, it's so interesting because what we're seeing here is a conversation of sorts between this notion of normal, be part of the main, don't be the outlier, don't not fit in, which I think is a powerful force. You can feel it in the mid 20th century of America. You know, you and I, as guys our age, were raised, I was born in 1959, we're very much part of that.
The age of conformity, it was called.
Yeah, you know,
the white picket fence, 2 kids, a dog.
Yeah, that's right. And it was really an odd period. People use that as a baseline, but that was a very odd period of mass production, a period of mass, frankly, when everybody says, I want to fit. You know, don't have me be outside of the realm. And it's interesting when my son was diagnosed, and I think you probably had a similar feeling, you know, well, before that, I said, you know, we were on the island of normal. And then we were exiled from it, our family, because we had a child who didn't fit. And we were told back in 1994, 95, cut your hopes and losses. This child, don't expect much from this child. We're so sorry. Everyone said, oh, we're so sorry your child has autism. I'm sure you heard that too, Richard. And, you know, that's where it started. So you can almost see the progression on all the things you're talking about and all the things you write about so powerfully in the book, even a progression in these 20 years that gets us to an understanding of how diversity really expresses itself in humans.
I think we
recognition.
Yeah. And I think we often live our lives in the present. We imagine the future and we don't realize just what we've come from. I mean, if you think about it, it was not that long ago that Erik Erikson had a child, father of child psychology, had a child with Down syndrome and sent the child to an institution and told his children that the baby had been stillborn and they didn't even know they had a brother until he died at the age of 35 from complications of Down syndrome. It wasn't that long ago that John F. Kennedy's sister, Rosemary, received a lobotomy because she was irritable and talked back and had a learning disability, and lobotomies were used to enforce conformity. If you were a good housewife after a lobotomy, it was a successful lobotomy. It's not that long ago that a generation of mothers was shamed and demeaned because they had children with autism. And Bruno Bettelheim asked all of these families to send their children to institutions so that they could be removed what he called the mother's black milk. It's not that long ago, only 40 years ago or so, that the famed psychologist Stephen Hinshaw discovered that his father's many absences during his childhood were from hospitalizations for bipolar disorder. And I said to him, how could you not know that your father was going away for months at a time and you didn't ask any questions? And he said, we knew not to ask. We knew not to ask. And what we're finding now is that we are in a new situation. And I think we should sometimes pat ourselves on the back when we do something right. Now, it doesn't mean we're there already, right? We got to always get better. But the history is important, you know, not just so we won't repeat it, but also so that we can figure out what we did right to get here.
And that's so important because we are on a path. We're not there yet, but we are moving and there's real progress here. And when that happens, we must celebrate it.
Ron, I think your son and your family has benefited from this change significantly. I mean, I maybe you could say a little bit about Owen and, what his life might have been like if he'd been born 30 years earlier.
Yeah, well,
I'm sorry to turn it on you. I want to hear what you have to say.
You and I, we think about it all the time. You with Isabel, me with Owen. Yeah, it was difficult when they were born. We were not where we are now back then. But 30 years prior, I mean, I actually sat with a young man, not a young man, he's about my age now, but who was sent to Bettelheim. He's about 60 now. He speaks with a device. He types. He also writes brilliant poetry. He does all sorts of things. He's got these powerful, what I call compensatory strengths that are off the charts. I call them X-Man skills. I mean, I believe, and I think there's some neuroscience to support this, that for every deficit, the brain creates an equal and opposite strength. The brain's amazingly viscous. It's always hacking solutions. And this person is full of them. And I heard that he actually was sent as a small boy, I think 4 or 5 years old, to Bettelheim for several years, and underwent really hell, and then was brought back home. And I said, what would you say to Bruno Bettelheim if he was here now? And he said, get a life. He said,
I remember my grandfather. My grandfather said that Bruno Bettelheim had set child psychology back a couple of generations. He was quite critical of him, and may have been some jealousy or envy within Chicago over, who was the most famous psychiatrist in the city. But, I look in Nobody's Normal at certain cases where you can compare the present and the past pretty clearly. And I profile a wonderful, lovely family in suburban Maryland and their son Patrick, who's about 25. And Patrick had a great uncle named Raymond. Just coincidentally, Raymond is the name of the main character in Rain Man, but this man's name was Raymond. And Raymond had pretty much the same symptom profile, same issues as Patrick. They were very similar in terms of their autism. But Raymond was much, much older. He was his great uncle. Raymond never held a job. Raymond never was able to do his own schoolwork. He didn't have any help within the school. Raymond never had any friends. He barely left the house for his entire life, living with his mother. And now we go to his great nephew, Patrick. And Patrick has friends. He has friends in his own way. They may not be friends in the way that the neurotypicals are friends, but he has his friends. He works at the library, stacking books. He has a job doing filing at a congressional office. They belong to a local pool. So during the summer, they go to the community pool, and everybody knows him there in the neighborhood. He does Special Olympics. So he gets to succeed and fail just like any other athlete. And you look at that and you say, wow, this man lives such a meaningful and rich life. And only a couple of generations ago, look at his great uncle. And his parents can remember the name of every single person who is a class aide or a babysitter or an occupational therapist, because there was such a big network and team around him. And when it comes to mental illnesses, when it comes to disabilities, when it comes to developmental disabilities, I throw all my eggs in the network basket.
What's so interesting is that you write in a sweep about the power of culture, different cultures and how they deal with the complexity of the human personality. How we, of course, had this powerful conforming urge and force in the United States, and how so much still of what we generally call the meritocracy still has powerful echoes and expressions of that. How we affirm and value things in society. Often it's in the middle of the bell curve, and a person who can hit that particular bell, but that is changing. And what I find fascinating is how you show stories of the wider world and stories back through history, where you see people struggling to sort of almost help teach or express how diverse human beings are and how we injure each other by laying stigma and fault on top of things that are innate about us that makes us different. I wonder if you would just read a beautiful section of the book. The book is full of things from literature, philosophy. It really ticks right along, Richard. Both sides of your brain work very well, my friend. Read that part, the Scarlet Letter, the Hester Prynne part. It's quite.
Okay.
I love this.
Sure. I actually pronounce it Prynne all my life. Maybe I'm pronouncing it wrong. I don't know.
You were probably right. So if it go with it.
Okay, so I would gather, the listeners to this event are, I'm sure, book lovers, and they also probably remember the Scarlet Letter. It's such a famous book. And I initially thought, why don't I start the last chapter with the Scarlet Letter? Because won't that be startling to people to take some old American 1850 novel and bring it into the discussion? The reason I do that, though, is because it's got this powerful ending that most people don't know or they forget. We remember the beginning of the book. A lot of people don't remember the end. So I'll read that section for you, and I'll try to make it fairly brief. There's a remarkable passage at the end of Nathaniel Hawthorne's 1850, The Scarlet Letter, when after a long absence, Hester Prynne returned to the scene of her crime. As her punishment for adultery, she had worn an embroidered red letter A on her breast. But after all those years, not even the harshest judge would force her to continue wearing it. She decides of her own free will to keep it fastened to her blouse because, the narrator tells us, the Scarlet Letter ceased to be a stigma which attracted the world's scorn and bitterness and became a type of something to be sorrowed over and looked upon with awe, yet with reverence too. The village now saw her as a source of comfort and strength, not as a person stained with sin. When people suffered the dreary burden of a heart, especially in matters of love or misplaced passion, they visited her cottage for counsel. They knew Hester would understand their pain. The goal of the punishment had been to marginalize Hester from society. But by claiming adultery for herself, as if with the pride of a 21st century LGBTQ advocate who has reclaimed the word queer from the bigots, she makes the letter a mark of dignity and experience rather than of shame. Both Hester's original stigma and its transformation into a sign of self-worth derived from her ongoing struggle between her individual character and her society's expectations, a struggle Hester embraced by returning to her community. The question for us is whether we can win our own struggle and take ownership of the words and practices that exclude and discriminate. The many victories described in this book suggest we can. Today, when someone wants their home or office to be neat and organized, they say they're a little OCD. The moody person says they're a little bit bipolar. And the introvert says they're on the spectrum. I don't believe such phrases belittle the seriousness of these conditions. For example, when comedian Jerry Seinfeld says he is on the spectrum, he does so with the full knowledge that many people with autism are profoundly intellectually disabled and need lifelong care. Similarly, when a student tells me that she has PTSD after taking a difficult final exam, she's not unaware that PTSD can involve severe and debilitating anxiety and can sometimes lead to suicide. But using the vocabulary of mental illness validates the growing acceptance that mental illnesses are a matter of degree and that they all exist on a spectrum. Most importantly, speaking these words more freely disarms the stigma of those illness labels by making them part of the general human condition, as Hester did when she continued wearing the letter A. Hester's label, Hawthorne wrote, seemed to give her the ability to see into people's hearts, exposing the outward guise of purity as a lie. Because everyone Hester met kept some kind of secret, her label conveyed to others not only that she would be sympathetic to them, as if the A was an ancient degree in clinical psychology, but also that she was more similar to them than different.
Wow. That's just gorgeous. And what I want you to guide the viewer, listener through is how the lessons baked into that famous passage and that story that everyone knows, how those lessons flow through the life we're living now. There still is stigma. There are stigmas that are falling slowly but surely. There is, in a way, a great participatory engagement that we're all a part of here. I'm a little OCD. I have PTSD. That test was terrible. Now, some people say, look, I know what PTSD is, and it's often very serious, and you don't have that. Yeah, we get that. Everyone knows the context now. It almost frees people to say, we are all part of really one thing, and it is this huge pageant.
This is a tough thing.
Yeah.
I mean, when you hear a good story about somebody who with autism who's achieved more than one ever imagined, one could respond and say, well, that's wonderful, but my child or my sibling or whoever it is more involved, is more impaired, will never be able to do that, will never speak, needs lifelong care. They're at that place in which they need such serious intervention. But I am a firm believer that there can be a tide that raises all boats. And if you look at the history in the book of what has transpired around the stigma of mental illnesses, and it's a roller coaster. It's not like, it was terrible and we slowly got better. There have been many fits and starts with 2 steps forward, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. And what we find is that there are moments when finally the understanding of serious mental illnesses helps us to understand the less serious ones. And then other moments where when we understand the less serious or more common self-limiting disorders, it destigmatizes the more serious ones because they inform each other. And so I praise the neurodiversity movement, not just because the neurodiversity movement has made it possible for us to see that people with autism can do so much more than we ever expected, but also because it has released the shame and the discomfort of people whose family members need significant care. Autism doesn't mean you were a bad mother. Autism doesn't mean that your child is doomed. Autism doesn't mean that you're not going to change over time.
What's interesting.
And I find great comfort in that.
Yeah, well, it's progress. And it allows our children and other children who are neurodiverse in the ways that we've mentioned to walk through the world in a new way, in a way that is distinct, that does accord them dignity, that doesn't say a broken brain, oh my. It says, well, look.
And I take it even further. I go even further to say that it doesn't just, this is not a tide that raises all boats for people on the autism spectrum. In the book, I talk about managers at large companies who have initiated autism hiring programs. And soon after they initiate the autism programs, someone with depression comes and says, I have depression and I wonder if I can have some time off, or I have sensitivity to these fluorescent lights that are bothering me. Or in one case, a manager told me about a woman who came to him and said that she wasn't feeling herself because she was having symptoms related to menopause. And she wanted him to understand how this might affect her work and to let her know she was deficient in her work. And he looked at me when he came to Washington and met with me in my office. He said, Richard, how have we gotten to this place? I just started this autism program a couple years ago. And now there's a woman who comes to me and she's willing to talk about a problem that calls attention to herself as a woman in corporate America, in corporate Australia in this case. that draws attention to herself as an aging woman at that. That's progress. And he attributed it to the neurodiversity programs, which he said generalized to make the stigma of any kind of illness lessened.
What's fascinating is you're speaking, Richard, of a cultural shift in America that is progress. But also in the book, you have fascinating passages about other parts of the world, Africa, for instance, in which many of these verities were understood and were part of the cultures of Africa that of course predate anything called America or the forces that shaped it. Tell us a little about that, because it's quite illuminating.
Well, I think one could easily go around the world and find horror stories, people who are suffering from severe mental illnesses and tied to an outbuilding or a tree or kept in shackles. One can find that. It's terrible. But one can also find instances, if you look for them, in which the kind of trite phrase, "it takes a village," really does take on meaning, where people are appreciated for what they can provide to the family. Nobody would expect them to live independently. One of the things that we know is that social supports are the primary influence on outcomes all over the world for any kind of condition, whether it's a biological disorder or a mental illness. And in the United States and in Western Europe, we've long emphasized this ideology that we have to be independent and autonomous, and the ideal person lives by themselves and establishes their own separate family. And when your kid's 18 or 21, they move out of the house and support themselves and so on. An ideology that really never gets enacted completely anyway, because we're all human. But the thing that one sees in other societies is less of an attention to independence and more of an understanding that this person is part of this community. And I tell the story of a boy with autism who, and I almost kicked myself when I said it, but I asked his parents, this is in Northeast Namibia, and I said to his parents, are you afraid of what will happen when you die? I mean, who's going to take care of Geshe? The reason I kicked myself is because I thought that was a very American question. And as an anthropologist, I always like to, imagine that I'm detached a little bit. And his father looked at me and he said, but we're not all going to die at once in the village. It was a meaningful comment saying, yes, my wife and I may die, his mother may die, his father may die, but there are all these other people and they'll still be here. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the World Health Organization studies that have been done on schizophrenia, one of the most serious and untreatable, very hard to treat conditions in the world. Prevalence rate about 1% throughout the world, but the outcomes vary significantly. The studies showed that people in non-industrial societies with schizophrenia had fewer psychotic episodes. Their psychotic episodes were less severe, and they had better outcomes in terms of things like marriage and employment. And where did they have the worst outcomes? In London and Washington, D.C. Nobody knows 100% why, but I would wager that it has to do with the greater social supports and the greater networks that are in place with people who live in joint families and in close-knit villages.
Yep. Tell me about where you are hoping we might be 10 years from now, 15 years from now. Think of the change that's happened just in the lifetime of our children. Let's project forward based on the trend lines that you write about with such precision in the book. Where might we be up ahead in 15 or 20 years?
That's a version of the famous job application question, right? Where do you see yourself in 10 years? It's a really challenging one. I don't have a crystal ball, but I will say this, that I think that the COVID pandemic is an opportunity. I think that there is the possibility to leverage this pandemic and these global stressors that are giving many people their first onset psychiatric disorder and exacerbating pre-existing psychiatric disorders, and to say that we need to make changes in prioritizing mental health care, developing mental health teletherapy, devising software and smartphone applications to monitor and surveil our loved ones to make sure that they're safe and that we can understand at what point they're not. I think that we need multidisciplinary teams in hospitals and clinics so that mental health isn't separated from other forms of health. And I think we need to pay attention to the mental health care of people who are isolated and at much more risk for mental illness than others: the elderly, undocumented immigrants, people who are experiencing homelessness. I think that COVID actually does provide an opportunity to try and make some big advances. And I wouldn't say that without a knowledge of history. At the end of World War II, my grandfather recognized, along with other people, that there had been many more cases of mental illness or psychiatric casualties, as they were called, in World War II than anybody expected. That normal people became sick in abnormal circumstances. And Truman, to his credit, leveraged that. He said, we're going to take this opportunity now to change things. And he established the National Institute of Mental Health, precisely because of the war. He then ordered the military to adapt its manual of mental disorders, called Medical 203, to become something that would eventually be
DSM.
with a different title, exactly, the DSM. Universities enhanced and built psychology departments and clinical psychology programs, and medical schools built new residencies. This was a huge burst, a real shot in the arm for mental health care and mental health research, because of this global crisis that said to people, to be stressed is not a bad thing. It is normal in a way. And I think we could do that with this pandemic as well.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that I think about, I ran into so much of what you're saying in a story that I did for the New York Times last year, a big story on COVID. What's fascinating about it is that the technologies that you referred to are one that we built. Using what we built for folks in the spectrum, we applied it to doctors in the front line of COVID. These are doctors in the emergency rooms and critical care, intensive care at New York Presbyterian Hospital and in Mass General. Mm-hmm. What's fascinating is these doctors, of course, were part in a way of the throwback world. You know, they would not acknowledge stress, even stress that was acute anxiety. Really, they're in hell. They're in COVID hell. But for these doctors, healers, literally, rather than say I'm sick, their leg can be on fire. They'd say I'm fine. Because, again, of these strong cultural norms that they still lived within. What we did is we set up a way they could talk to one another in a private Zoom where they could get a friend. And once a week, they would check in with the friend and talk in private about how are you feeling. And I threw 3 questions up. How are you feeling? What do you fear? And what are your hopes? That posted automatically in a 10-minute session. What was fascinating as we went through this month and a half where they were using the platform, the doctors started to say, this is saving me, helping me. This is helping me deal with acute stress, an overwhelm where I can't even really talk to my husband or wife about it. But here is someone else who understands, with whom I can share. The fact is that my constitution is taking on infirmity, if you will, from the external forces of what's being thrown at me every day. You can
I love the story. Love that story. I mean, did you have a question there? Do you want me to just?
No, it's just your story. It's like, this is a story. I can add this to Richard. This is in the book, Richard.
But I realize that I'm so sorry.
In my name, you'll see a big giant story about it, big 5,000 word thing.
Okay.
You can see essentially these doctors.
I got I'm sorry. My electrical plug came out. I need to plug back
Okay,
in. I'm
well,
so sorry. Keep
no,
going,
no,
okay?
don't worry. So I'll just tell this story about COVID. So what was interesting is that so many of the messages of progress and of the challenges we face and how we're able to see ourselves and have others see us in a way that doesn't run from uh, uh, the um, uh, the complications of living in the modern world, of the way we take on illness and work through it and fight into sunlight. All those things that are part of everyone's life, and how these doctors, in a way, could take off the mask of normal, what one of them called my
You
John
know,
mask, and
what I
open
love though,
us. It's beautiful.
what I love about that story, Ron, is because there's a message in there, which is that mental health care isn't necessarily going to somebody who's got an MD.
Yeah.
Mental health care is not necessarily going to someone who has a PhD. These doctors talking to each other over Zoom is mental health care, right?
It was.
So we need to think more broadly about what is mental health care. It doesn't mean you have to go out there and find somebody with a shingle outside that says, Dr. So-and-so, psychiatrist.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
It was.
we know that because people give mental health care all over the world without psychiatry.
Yeah. Yeah. These were doctors who basically we helped them build a peer-to-peer self-support network that was therapy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's what it was. And it helped them through a crisis and to come up the other end, one might suggest less injured and than they might otherwise have been. And there's so many messages in that, of just, and I think that's part of what our children taught us. I mean, my older son, Owen's older brother, Walter, my older son, says, Owen is my best teacher. The whole family says that. A child who couldn't speak for years, who only learned to speak by memorizing dozens of all the Disney animated movies, turned it into emotional speech and expression. He helped me get out of some of the ways that I would essentially work to present myself as a perfect apple to the world and not give in to the reality of what was real about my life and about areas of need, about times in which I struggled, about all that was essential to seeing myself truly and embrace what I saw in the mirror. And I think that's what our kids taught us. It made us, I think, better in the professional lives we lead, Richard. I'm sure you, like me, in some ways, our kids made us stronger and clearer about just how deliciously complex life is, how the presentation under the structure of conformity of the normal is a fiction and a foolishness.
Yeah. There are lots of fictions that I learned, and that's one of them. Another fiction is this idea that there's a little window of plasticity in early childhood, and there isn't great growth that goes on after that.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary to see what someone with a disability can do when they have the support, when they're appreciated. And I would say that many of Isabel's greatest achievements and spurts in terms of her growth and maturity happened after the age of 18 or 20. We keep growing. And we don't just keep growing, but we interact with the changes in our society and in our community. Some of the real heroes in my book are the young people who really show us the changes, that they're there. We're not going to see those changes as clearly if we interview somebody who's 80, 90 years old. They're perhaps still in a context that's a little bit older. But if we look at the students that I teach, 18, 19, 20, 21 years old. I mean, we had a student in a big lecture class recently, 300 students in the class. And he came up to the professor in our department and he said, "Can I make an announcement to the class before we start? Because I have Tourette's syndrome and I might say something offensive, and I want the students to understand. So the professor said, okay, tell the students. And so he stood up and he said, hi, everybody, I'm so-and-so, I have Tourette's syndrome. That means I sometimes blurt out things that I can't control. It's a neurological disorder and you might find offensive. And the students were so happy. And the professor was happy. And the student with Tourette's was happy. Somebody must have really helped this young man to learn how to advocate himself. For himself, probably his teachers, probably his parents. I mean, these are the kinds of changes that we're seeing. These are the real heroes that are changing this landscape. The students that wear T-shirts in my university that say, I hate normal people. And you can take that for what it is. But there's a silver lining there, right?
Yeah, yeah. Look, I'll throw in a literary reference to match your Hester Prynne that flows right into this. I, as a young man, was on a different path. I was off to probably law school. I was running political campaigns for a living. And a brilliant woman who was a press secretary in a campaign, I was the manager. We were 22 years old, gave me a book called Winesburg, Ohio by Sherwood Anderson, a famous novel of the 20th century. I had never read it. She had read every book at that point. She was kind of a prodigy on literature and writing. And there's a passage in the book that I didn't fully understand until later in my life. That's lovely. Winesburg, Ohio, it's about a fictional town in Ohio. And Anderson writes that on the edge of town, there's an orchard. And if you go there, you'll find that the pickers have left behind the twisted apples in favor of those perfect ones. But if you pick one of those twisted apples, you will find that they're delicious. You see, part is twisted, but the sweetness gathers with peculiar intensity in that big rounded side. It wasn't until some years later, as I gazed upon my son who couldn't speak, as everyone said, oh, we're so sorry. And I realized that here I had a twisted apple, part twisted with sweetness gathering with peculiar intensity in that rounded side. And suddenly I saw that ultimately we are all twisted apples with pockets of sweetness and twists. And the examined life is very much about recognizing that, in knowing thyself in this way. And that's so much about what your book shows. It shows how society, with all of its needs to be productive, to conform, for everyone to get in line, for the outliers to be thrown out, those twisted apples, well, they're in the bin. How we are growing, not just as individuals, but encouraged by a culture that is growing with us. And that's why this is a beautiful book that in a way is a kind of summation, Richard, of many, many books you have written, in my mind, of a life journey of search. Tell me finally, we just have a few minutes left, what this book has taught you in its search and find, in your investigations, in your renderings, that, like every child, these books are like our kids. What has this book taught you that has changed you in some way?
Well, I guess I want to go back to to a question that you've asked, in your own work, which is the question of what constitutes a meaningful life.
Yeah.
And I have met so many people in the course of doing this research, people with disabilities, their family members, who redefine what that means. And the meaningful life doesn't have to be something that fits completely within the framework of capitalism and independence and autonomy that I talked about earlier. It's led me to appreciate someone else's happiness, rather than what I think their happiness should be. I met a young woman who works at a local grocery store, and she bags groceries, and she's autistic. And her mother had been very unhappy that she was bagging groceries. She wanted something with more dignity, she felt, for her daughter than this. But her daughter loves bagging groceries. She loves them. She loves the people she works with. She loves that she's good at it and that she knows what to put where so the eggs don't break and the bread doesn't get squished. She loves the regularity of the customers who come in, the regular customers, so that she's not surprised by unexpected sorts of things. And it took her mother a long, long time to sort of get up to speed on this, that she was leading a lovely life in her own way, and that she had found something that she loved. You know, not everybody's going to be socially awkward and have difficulty with social communication and be able to be Bill Gates. You know, that's the rarity. We have that television show, The Good Doctor. We don't have, you know, a television show called The Good Grocery Bagger, because we seem to, you know, idolize a particular kind of life and a particular kind of productivity. And I think as a society, we can learn from these meaningful lives. And this has a lesson for all of us. It has a lesson for people who are stay-at-home parents. I mean, is a stay-at-home parent less than because they're not productive in the sense of earning a wage? Mm-hmm. I think it has something to teach us about volunteerism and doing work that may not bring you remuneration. So there are many, many lessons we can draw. And I learned in this book that if we draw a silo and say, oh, I'm studying autism, or I'm studying schizophrenia, or I'm studying mental illness or physical illness, we lose sight of the fact that we're all connected by a common fabric that's woven into our lives.
Yeah. Beautiful. It's beautiful. You know, I love you mentioning that line from our book, Who Decides What a Meaningful Life Is? Something Cornelia and I said many times to each other, usually after we left an appointment with a doctor, and sitting in the car, driving side by side, the lines from the highway going under the wheels. And what's so evocative about the sentence is not just the word meaning and our search for meaning and how we find meaning. Of course, that is at the core of what makes us human. But who decides? Because it may not be you, and it should. Society may be, from the time you wake up, even as a small person, you're starting to, all of us, take on society's judgments as to what meaning is. That's not the way it should work. It should be bottom up like so many things these days. We, each of us, find meaning in different ways in our life. And that meaning is valid. That meaning is at the core of our human journey. And there are countless ways in which people find it. It's not anything that is part of a conformist decision. Sorry, not meaningful. Next. And that's so much the lesson of this book. So much, I think, the lesson of both of our lives. That's why it's a joy, Richard, to sit and talk with you.
Well, I'm so grateful we were able to do this.
Yeah. Well, look, so the book is, I'm going to hold it up.
And it's a joy to listen and hear from both of you. Oh my God.
Nobody's normal.
Thank you so much for what a beautiful conversation. Thank you. Just remind everyone that's watching, you can order the book by pressing the green button at the bottom of the screen and we'll ship it right off to you, or you can curbside pick up if you're in Miami. I thank you for joining us this evening. Stay safe, be well. I hope we'll see each other in person in Miami someday soon. But thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Great joy.
Bye.